What is your darkest family secret? My grandfather was killed in a bar when my father was still a toddler. The official story was that he was murdered over a pinball game. Back then pinball was pretty serious, I guess. It wasn't until recently my grandmother confessed, on her deathbed, that my grandfather actually killed someone and buried the body days before his own demise. So he was actually killed in retaliation for a murder that he committed. My grandmother kept this secret for almost 65 years. A male blood relative went to prison for drug dealing and major theft. Whilst in prison he was diagnosed with Hep C, likely from sharing needles. When he got out of prison, he RP'd his 13-year-old stepdaughter. There's a high likelihood that he RP'd his other daughters. One died from a drug overdose and the other committed suicide. He died in prison from Hep C complications and liver cancer. A not too distant cousin FK'd over his notoriously dangerous bikie gang in a big way, including forcing himself on someone's wife and stealing a high-ups motorbike, and has been on the run for the last 20 years. A year or two after her adoptive mother died, my mom went looking for information about her birth parents, and found that her birth mom and her husband had been gruesomely murdered by a drug cartel. There was an article about their murder in Rolling Stone magazine that had gory pictures of their bodies. It's me. My dad never told his family I existed. I was shameful. Maybe he was more ashamed. After he died they found out about me and kindly asked me not to come to the funeral. I get why he never told them. My dad gave a job to a cousin. I remember as a kid that this cousin I'd never heard of just suddenly popped up out of nowhere without explanation, but I was a kid so didn't really think of it. But everyone made a big deal out of how great it was for my dad to give him a job. I found out 20 years later that he'd been in prison for having a SZL relationship with a student. Father won the lottery and we've been pretending to be poor so our family doesn't try to ask for money. No one in my family can give me an honest answer on how many siblings I have. My cousin, once removed, my parents' cousin, was kidnapped, RP'd and tortured by a serial killer. She was, after many days, dropped off near a running path with her neck slit. She lived, unlike the other three, and she could lead the police to his home. He is still in prison. As a child I heard whispering of it and didn't find out the whole truth until I was older. Edit. Not great aunt. Second cousin. Edit 2. My cousin. Once removed. My great grandfather shot and killed a man in his grocery store back in the 30s over a poker game. He ran a speakeasy out of the back of his store and lost almost $2k, so as the guy was walking out the front after the store closed he shot him and got away with it by telling the police the man robbed him. It wasn't until he was on his deathbed he told my grandfather what had happened. Edit. This was in Ohio. One family member killed another by leaving a bag of poisoned donuts on the front steps. They are now hesitant about accepting donuts. My grandma has been having an affair with a family friend's husband for 28 years. My great uncle was born from his sister being uphead by her father. The family said basically she had just been a loose lady and not right in the head. They locked her up in the attic. After my great uncle passed, my mother and I went into the multi-generation house to clean it out. The door to the attic, where sister mom was kept but long since passed. The door had an outside lock. No creepy claw marks or anything. But it was just so sad. My mom pulled the lock off and announced to the house that she would never be shut away again. I had an uncle who moved far away. Worked in a boiler room at a huge casino. Decades ago. He was always sketchy. And he had way more money than a simple boiler room employee ought to have had. Rumors that the boiler room was a really useful thing for the mob, due to boilers doubling as incinerators for certain purposes. Hence the money. Many unanswered questions there. Guess it's kinda obvious that your uncle got paid to look the other way while the mob used the boiler room to cook their pizzas. As part of opening a home daycare, Mom found somebody on the sex offender registry with our family's very unusual last name. Mom called grandpa. He confirmed that he is related to us. He hadn't seen him in decades. He didn't know he had been convicted for statutory but thought that sounded about right. We're not supposed to ask about him again. In the film Driving Miss Daisy, when the chauffeur, played by Morgan Freeman, is driving Miss Daisy to worship service, they get stuck in a traffic jam. He gets out to see what the holdup is. When he gets back in, he says you won't be going to service today. Somebody done bombed the temple. Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple. Atlanta. 1958. He says what? Who would do such a thing? My uncle. That's who. I found out 6 months before my dad died that he was a heroin addict earlier in his life. He was dying of liver disease and tried to overdose one night. I didn't live with him at the time but knew something was wrong, and that's when my mom and I went and found him on the floor of his bathroom with a needle in his arm. My brother shot himself in the leg to get out of Iraq and tried to blame it on an enemy attack. I learned about this the day I arrived in Afghanistan for my year-long tour. All I heard was that he was shot. I found out later it was a self-inflicted wound and he was out on suicide watch and was kicked out with a less than honorable discharge. He's never actually told anyone this. I just heard it through the National Guard being kind of like a gossipy small town. I actually don't hold it against him. War sucked. He's absolutely ruined his life since then by becoming an alcoholic and sitting the world out. Just sad all around. Also, my mom and her sister married the same man, so all my siblings are also cousins with each other. I learned my disabled great aunt was ARPed multiple times while she was in high school, including by a teacher, and it resulted in at least 3 pregnancies that she was forced to carry and give up for adoption. And then shamed for. I found out because I did 23andMe found cousins my dad couldn't explain, so there was a very awful phone call to understand why disabled women are at the highest risk for sexual assault. I am so sorry. Found out last year that I am a direct descendant Thomas Rood. He was the first person to be executed for incest in the US. He ARPed his daughter Sarah and it came to light when she gave birth to a son named George. My family line is descended from George. Had an uncle that was a sharpshooter in the US Navy. And there's a famous movie about a mission he was on. This whole thread has me wondering if becoming an uncle instantly turns you into an insane person. Early 90s, my uncle's stepson murdered my uncle's wife and his 2 daughters. He survived barely. My great uncle molested my mom for many years, around age 3 or 4 till her teens, as well as molesting or exposing himself to her 3 sisters. He also molested at least 2 of his sons and other children from his church. Not much of a secret, I guess, since he confessed. Got a pathetic sentence of house arrest and my stupid great aunt is still with him. Dad's cousin was a prominent Catholic priest known for his staunchly anti-LGBT views. Well, it was quite the surprise when he was arrested trying to solicit a blowjob from an undercover cop at a gay bookstore in New Orleans. My dad died of a drug overdose when he was only 25. I was 6 months old. Our family and his hid the true reason and told everyone it was a heart attack. This is even what I grew up thinking. Only my mom, my aunt, 2 uncles, and my 4 grandparents knew the real cause. I found out the real cause of his death when I had to get his death certificate for college financial aid. And now I am burdened with continuing the lie to the greater community who knew him. Edit. Holy hell, this blew up overnight. I am trying to respond to all comments, but apologies if I can't. And thank you for the awards. My great-great-grandmother had a black father and was considered really taboo in the 1860s. My great-grandmother is 98 years old and was telling us about a guy who was black and absolutely adored her in the 1920s and early 30s and would come over to play with her, but the family had to keep it a secret as he was black and she was white. Story goes that her grandmother married her grandfather. My great-grandmother's mom had to pretend that he worked as the help on the farm in South Dakota when he was really his father. She told us about it when my grandfather did a DNA test and it came back that he was part black and had black family members. We only found out last year. I'll see you at cookout. Edit. Thanks for the awards. My cousin sexually abused me when I was 7. He was 17. And it messed me up and now I have to pretend I'm happy he's getting the organ transplant he needs. I hope the F-King dies. My family is of Swiss descent. My great-grandfather murdered someone back in Switzerland then fled to the US with his wife. They moved to a small town in Virginia and had my grandpa along with his siblings. Grandpa only found out about this because he found multiple journals depicting the turmoil it caused between him and his wife while fleeing to the US. My great-great-grandparents were cousins. I don't have wiggly bones so I guess I'm alright. Close bracket. Semicolon. Edit. It's a dark secret because they ran away from Sicily because the family was against it. From what I was told. Edit 2. Can people stop telling me to calm down? I don't know where it's coming from but I'm fine. This is my family's thing. It's not like I'm over here freaking out. My mom walked in on my uncle servicing the best man the night before he married my aunt. This was the mid 1960s. So being bi or gay wasn't something many people admitted to. She said nothing to anyone. Only told my dad years later. Edit. Whoa. This blew up. I thought about deleting it because it's not really a dark family secret. Thank you for the nice comments and awards. My grandpa was kidnapped and forced to work for the Viet Cong. When he died in combat, no one on either side would claim him so he was buried in an unmarked grave. My grandma was left caring for 3 kids, my mom, aunt, uncle. Grandma was working in the fields until someone got her to work as a bar girl in Saigon. She met my now step-grandfather, American GI, and they got married and she moved to Ohio with him. She never told him she had any kids BC she didn't think he would marry her. When my mom came to America 2 decades later, my grandma made her say my mom was her niece. I still call him uncle. I got pregnant at 23 and my family made me keep the pregnancy a secret because it was disgraceful because I wasn't married. I ended up having a miscarriage but my family felt it was stupid for me to grieve and has swept it under the rug. Years ago my cousin's girlfriend had a miscarriage and I hated seeing my mom cry over it. It made me angry because I wasn't allowed to grieve yet she was grieving over someone not even related to us. My cousin might actually be my uncle. His mom boinked my grandfather not long before she discovered her pregnancy. There hasn't been a paternity test. But my cousin learned about it and it FK'd him up. Edit. For clarity. The mom married into the family. So when they did the deed, it was his father and daughter-in-law. I once borrowed my granddad's video camera for a trip. He said he put a fresh tape in the camera for me and gave me a backup. I was like 12 at the time and into filming stuff BC. I wanted to be a director. Get back from the trip, rewind the tape and review the footage. Low light in a room I didn't recognize. 2 people. One laying down, another to the side, bobbing her. Oh my god, my grandparents made a PRNO and granny was blowing papa. I told my dad what I saw. We never spoke of it and they have no idea I know. Papa took that secret to the grave with him 3 years ago. And I got F-King decades to live with that scar now. When I was little I found out my mother was hated by her entire family due to she having a different mother than all her siblings, and I only know this because I was hated due to me having a different father than all of my siblings, so my grandmother told me, her biological mom. My mom left me at 15 months old with my teenage father. Neither wanted me, but when my dad married my stepmom, she really hated me and the mother I never knew and told me all the time. I understand how you feel. B rank. Learning that my great grandfather had sexually abused at least one of his daughters. My great aunts. Particularly the youngest. His abuse of the youngest resulted in him getting jail time. It was the only time he was punished. This was in the mid 50s. A rank. learning that one of these molestations resulted in a pregnancy for the second eldest, which was given up through a closed adoption. This was around 1949. S-rank. Learning that the eldest actually took her father to bed and wanted to be his wife. She saw herself, not her mother, as his real and natural wife for the rest of his life. This was from the late 1940s through his death in 1986. Whether or not a conjugal relationship continued is unknown. But maybe that will be the next thing I learn. My grandparents made a wonderful life for themselves and their children. Those children and their children, my generation, had a great life. Learning about what happened before that was so shocking I can't put it in words. You know it's gonna be rough when the beat-hair is already sexual abuse. Oof. My mom's brother would pay her nearly every day, if not multiple times a day, from the time she was 6 until she was about 16. He did this to my aunt a few times as well. But my mom would volunteer to milk the cows to prevent it from happening to my aunt, as that's when he would assault them. He died a slow, painful death years ago, but was never held accountable. He completely destroyed my mom, which really f***ed up my siblings and my childhood. I am actually the dark family secret. All of my brothers and sister know, but they don't know that I know. They've kept the secret from everyone except one person. And that person told me. My mother had a secret affair that resulted in pregnancy, and my father raised me like I was his own. I sometimes contemplate about whether to tell my sons, but probably won't. I actually recalled having met the other father when I was really young, but not since, and not interested in meeting him now. Both of my parents have passed, so I'm not going to make any issues out of it. My grandmother was married 3 times, not twice like I'd been told. Apparently her first marriage was to a gay man and quickly dissolved. This was presented to me as a big family secret, but I like cool, I'm 12. But I did end up digging up their marriage certificate on Ancestry in college. I wasn't going to answer this, but here I go. There was a man who was my grandmother's brother. My sister and I referred to him as Uncle J. Well, Uncle J was a weird dude, but then again my family on that side always seemed a bit out there. I found out many years later after he died of cancer that he was a rapist, and no one in the family wanted to acknowledge it. He raped my mother and some of her cousins. Now we spent some holidays in the house that he lived in, and he was always drunk, but I'm honestly f***ing irate that my mother didn't keep us away from someone like him. Had he still been alive about 10 years ago, I would probably have killed him myself once I found out what he did. Long story short, if you are the parent of young children and you don't keep them away from predators, you are failing your children. My great-grandfather. He did what? My great-great-grandmother, single, came over from Germany after World War I. And had a kid 2 months later. She met a guy and worked for him for about a decade. Mysteriously having 2 more kids during that time. Eventually she got married and moved away. And left the kids with the man. She eventually had my great-grandfather. And he grew up without knowing anything about his half-siblings. That was until about 70 years later, when one of their daughters sent a letter to my grandma explaining their relationship. They promptly met up and realized they had only been living about 20 miles from each other. And the relationship rekindled from there. They even came to my grandpa's funeral in '99. Where it was revealed that some of the family actually did know about them all along. When people asked how they were related, the older family members would refuse to elaborate and would brush them off. My father, however, would make sure to tell the story to everyone who asked, and made sure these older family members could hear it all. My uncle is currently in a relationship with a famous Japanese PRN star. Oh. And then there's the time we found a body in the wall of my grandparents' house while we were trying to figure out where a leak was coming from. Turns out my great-grandfather killed around 5 people. Never knew why. Still freaks me out. Lots of pedophiles. Shady money double dealings. And murders. Dealt and received. Mental illnesses abound for the survivors. Hardly surprising. Honestly, if there's a real secret, it's if someone's actually doing okay. As far as I know, that whole side of the family is Furuakt. The family secret on the other side of the family is that the surname passed down for 5 or maybe 6 generations was just selected one day by an ancestor who moved countries and needed a surname for paperwork and cultural norms. So just choose one he'd heard one and liked the sound of. Then he had 7 kids. And one of his sons had 14 kids. And most of those kids had a fair few kids themselves, and now there is a whole pile of FKs running around with this ancestral name which reaches a dead end 6 generations back if they try to trace it. Like the guy just sprung fully formed out of the earth. As a genealogist, that last name bit is one of my biggest research nightmares.